And then I guess the reporting is at the moment that once that's done, they're going to then, go all in for Matthias Rayan Cherki from Olympique Lyon, 20-year-old French attacking midfielder. We're very lucky at Transfermarkt that we have people from all over the world that know something about different players. And I know you spoken to our colleague in France, Ronan Karoff, about this guy. So what did Ronan tell you?
Yeah, so, I mean, this is such an interesting one, and this wasn't like me doing like a kind of scouting report or anything. It was just me kind of talking in passing about Cherki. I was actually very tempted to write my newsletter on him this week, actually, but I returned to one of my favourite loves, which is Niklas Sula, for some reason. So I wrote about him instead. So if you haven't read that yet, please go find it if you're a Dortmund fan. Talking about him ahead of this new season. But yeah, Cherki is such an interesting one because he's so highly regarded in French football, but then equally, Lyon seemed quite content with letting him go. So I did kind of chase up Ronan, as you said. We'll have to have him on the podcast sometime. He's a really great guy, and he knows French football inside out. And I kind of just wanted to know, if this guy was so good, why would Lyon be letting him go? And there's basically two reasons behind it. Now, we should talk about how good he really is, and it's worth saying that he really is, on paper, an outstanding player. He's an attacking midfielder. I would probably sum him up as a kind of, I guess, a player who can play the wings or as a number 10. The things I think he seems to really excel in is his dribbling and his key passes. So a key pass is a pass that obviously leads to a shot. So we're talking about a player who can skip by defenders, who can set up other players, a player that can really kind of break the line and cause, just all sorts of trouble in the final third. So on paper, he's an exceptionally talented player, but there are some issues around him that I think Dortmund fans should probably be made aware of. And I'm not really, this isn't kind of groundbreaking stuff. This is just news that's been quite well documented in France, and for one reason or another, maybe just hasn't made it over to, people who follow the Bundesliga in English. Anyway, what Ronan told me was that, he's a great player with a huge amount of potential, and the reason that Lyon are looking to sell him is because basically they've been bitten by FFP, the financial fair play ruling, and they have to sell players. And because Cherki, I keep calling him Cherki, Cherki is a youth product, it means if they sell him, goes in as pure profit, and it basically counts more. So, for example, if they sold him for 30 million euros or 25 or whatever, is pure profit, as opposed to a player they signed a few years ago for 15 million euros. The profit only counts against the money they paid for. So that's a brief explanation for why Lyon and a lot of clubs, particularly in England, are just selling as many young players as they can this summer. So that's one reason. The other reason as well is that he does have a very complicated personality, and Ronan put me onto this quite big story in Eurosport France, which kind of really documented all the stuff that Cherki has gone through as a young player. And the kind of gist of it is that he's a player of a big personality, and at times that can kind of get in the way of his development. And actually, I've got some quotes here. They kind of speak to some, basically they speak to a few scouts and directors of football and French football off the record. And some of the quotes they got talking about Cherki is quite interesting. I'll read out one, for example. They say, Lyon are an interesting team to observe because you can clearly see which players are wearing the overalls and who have a team spirit. He is not one of them. His non-verbal language is terrible. Seeing that, the recruiters of big clubs say to themselves, what can he bring to us except for trouble? And this is what Ronan said to me. He's a player who routinely, well documented in French football for, picking fights with his players, his own teammates, for, rolling his eyes, sighing, quite, notably frustrated. He's just one of these players who wears his emotions on his sleeve, really. And the article makes a really interesting comparison to Zaire Emery, the young player at PSG. And basically, one of the recruiters in French football basically said when these two guys were like 16 or 17, they were basically like for like in terms of their talent. But Zaire Emery has basically gone on leaps and bounds at PSG because he has the right attitude. And as they claim, Cherki doesn't have the right attitude. And they then go on to compare him to Ben Afra, who kind of notoriously was, for people who maybe are a bit younger, Ben Afra was kind of one of the most highly regarded French footballers 10 or 15 years ago, but just ended up being one of these players who bounced around from one club to the next because he just wasn't able to really commit himself, or, just ultimately just his personality got in the way. So I think that's a really fascinating kind of context to it all, because, and by no means am I saying that we should take all that as gospel. I'm really just saying that's the kind of tone, that was the impression I've been given of how he's seen in France right now. But at the end of the day, we are talking about a player who's just about to turn 21, who's already played a lot of football, came through a pretty chaotic club in Lyon. And I think it's quite interesting that he apparently has specifically chosen Dortmund out of a number of clubs that want to sign him. And I can understand why, for two reasons. One, Dortmund obviously have a great reputation for developing players, have a great reputation for selling them to big clubs. And, as we all know, if you do well at Dortmund, it's only a matter of time before a Man City, Real Madrid, Man United, or whoever else, Chelsea, come along and swoop in and pick you up. But I would actually go so far as to say that Dortmund actually have a pretty decent record of straightening out young players as well, who are perceived to have bad personalities or perceived to be lazy, or, and more often than not, they're really just kids. But at times, the one that really comes to mind is Jadon Sancho, who left England with a reputation and returned to England with a reputation. But at Dortmund, they only ever spoke very highly of him. And if he did, leave for Germany with a reputation, Dortmund obviously did a lot to make sure that didn't get in the way of his development. So I think it's an interesting one. I think it is a risk, but it might be a risk that's worth taking for Dortmund, just because they obviously have a lot of experience in dealing with young players who are very, very aware of their own talent, are very impatient with players around them who maybe don't either share that ambition or don't have the capacity to match that ambition on the pitch. I guess you could say Jude Bellingham's maybe another example of that. But Dortmund always seem to find a way to keep these guys happy, to get them playing well, and ultimately develop them into the players they were supposed to be.
I mean, that's incredible, fascinating insight. And, I think that in Nuri Sahin, there is maybe also a coach in place at Borussia Dortmund now who, we have to remember how young Nuri Sahin was, right? When he started his Bundesliga career, for a long time, he was the youngest Bundesliga player in history. When he made his debut, right? And that development was anything but linear. He had to go out on loan to the Netherlands at one point, right? And it almost seemed like his development was actually going to completely fall off the cliff before it picked up again. And then he went to Real Madrid and Liverpool and all that and came back, right? But he, more than anyone else, would know what it means for young players to grow and develop. So I think he is maybe really well suited to help a player like Cherki along, and maybe some of these other young talented players that Dortmund has really struggled to develop under Edin Terzic, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why Terzic ultimately left the club, is because that was one of the shortcomings. We've talked plenty about the Gio Reyna and Moukoko, for example, right? I also think what else is happening in Lyon is really fascinating too. And I mean, you see this with a lot of French clubs. Their ownership structures are often very complicated and complex and not always very understandable for outsiders. And there is a very strong emphasis in French academies on discipline. And lack of discipline can often lead to players that are very talented to not necessarily stay at their clubs. We see this at PSG all the time, where young talented players often have to go elsewhere to develop, right? Because they're maybe not seen as a perfect French specimen. And so I think that is going on there. And I think the other thing too is that Olympique Lyon is now part of this Eagle Group, this multi-club ownership group owned by John Textor, who is one of the founders of Fubo TV. And they have signed an attacking midfielder already from Atlanta United, right? And Thiago Almada, who has been parked at Botafogo. Conveniently parked there, I guess, because Botafogo will be the club that has paid the transfer fee, and then you can sell Cherki and you can bring in Almada, and I think on paper that will be like whatever Dortmund paid them will be the income, right? There's not, you talked about FFP here. If Almada comes in from another club on a free transfer, then that looks great, and you have a replacement right there and there. So I think that is all very interesting, and it really shows you how complex some of these things are, and not always straightforward. And there's maybe a domino or puzzle piece that's like completely somewhere around the world that kind of fits in there as well. As for Cherki, I just think that Dortmund, if they can get him going, I think that'll be a really good addition to the club, Stefan.
Yeah, and fundamentally, he's also a player that they desperately need. Even going, putting aside, any personality issues potentially, and the whole round and round we go with them signing young players who eventually want to go play for Manchester City or whatever else, and that's a whole other story which we've talked and written about extensively. But at the end of the day, and this is something I've also wrote about, Dortmund just do not have enough playmakers. I was reading something actually the other day in one of the forums that I think Julian Brandt's now the longest serving member of the squad, I believe, which is just kind of crazy when you consider I still think of him as this kind of boy band-esque 21-year-old. But I think he is the oldest member of the squad, or not the oldest, but the one who's been in the squad the longest. And he's still the unspoken kind of workhorse of this team in terms of creating chances, in terms of creating key passes, in terms of pulling the strings. Dortmund only really power when he's at the top of his game, and that's because he's a great player, but it's also because they just don't have any other players that can do it. We had hope for Gio Reyna, it didn't really work out. Jude Bellingham obviously moved on. Marcel Sabitzer kind of started to in the second half of the season, and I think he'll probably have a big season this coming year, so he could do well. We hope Felix Nemcha might do it. It hasn't really worked out for him quite yet either. And Dortmund are a team, if you kind of look at the makeup of their side, they've got a lot of wide players, they've got a lot of wide forward, a lot of wingers, but they don't really have a lot of creative midfielders. And if Cherki was to come in and play as a kind of central kind of number 10, or even as a central midfielder who can run past players, who can thread through balls, who can create chances, then, if he can stay on the straight and narrow, and if he can kind of develop his potential, then he could be a player that they desperately need next season, and could be a huge difference to that squad.
I guess Pascal Gross is supposed to be a bit of a playmaker too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great point. Yeah, his attacking stats are fantastic as well. He's a kind of like a deep line playmaker, I would say. But in terms of like his key passes are in the top 94 percentile in the Premier League last year. His progressive passes 95%, forward pass accuracy 88%. So he's definitely a player who can pull the strings, and he would actually be a great kind of player that I feel like slotting him instead of someone like an Emre Can or an Oz Can into that midfield would completely change the way that Dortmund team play. So yeah, it's very exciting for Dortmund right now.